Well, we're going to start with our second panel on GeoField rapid impact use cases. So again, maybe just to set the stage for these three projects. As I mentioned, we kicked off our GeoField initiative in the fall of last year. And one of our very first set of challenges was identifying what we thought of as kind of shovel-ready examples of opportunities to integrate Earth observation into impact evaluations. So we sought out partners who had existing impact evaluations or projects that were relatively far along into which we could partner and integrate this. And so what you'll see today are three projects that have recently been launched. And the plans for how to integrate Earth observation with maybe a few kind of teaser results in there, but much of the work is still in the months ahead to actually kind of turn the crank and get those results and share them again with all of you, hopefully in the fall of this coming year, and with a lot of work still, as I said, TBD. So maybe with that, I'll turn it over to our first presenters, Lauren Sharwood from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and Kunmar Singh from our A-Data Research Lab here at William & Mary. Lauren and Kunmar.
Thank you, Ariel. Good morning, everyone. In areas where irrigation is not viable, rainwater harvesting techniques presents a powerful option for improving agricultural productivity. This study is about measuring rainwater harvesting techniques adoption in Niger using Earth observation data and products to assess its impacts on socioeconomic and agricultural productivity. My name is Dr. Kunmar Singh. I'm a senior geospatial scientist at the A-Data Research Lab and an affiliate faculty in the Center for Geospatial Analysis at William & Mary. With me, my co-presenter, Lauren Sharwood. She's an associate remote sensing specialist at MLab at the University of California, Santa Barbara. She will provide a background on rainwater harvesting techniques adoption and ground surveys in Niger, while I will talk about Earth observation component. Let me turn things over now to Lauren.
Hi, everyone. So in Niger, a growing population and need for food has led to farming on more unproductive land. This extensification, along with more extreme rainfall patterns, contributes to land degradation, leaving farmers more exposed to weather shocks. Across the Sahel region in West Africa, climate adaptation requires agricultural practices that increase the level and duration of water stored within the soil to help replenish soil nutrients. Demi-lunes and zai planting pits are rainwater harvesting water catchment techniques that help this rainwater infiltrate into the soil. They can help reduce soil degradation, lower risk of crop failure, and increase profits, but their adoption still remains low. Next slide. So in conjunction with Niger's Ministry of Environment, Jenny Aker and Kelsey Jack conducted a randomized control trial clustered at the village level to test the importance of different barriers to demi-lune adoption. Farmers in 180 different villages were assigned to one of 4 treatment arms or a control arm. So this first training only intervention was meant to address information constraints. 16 farmers in each of these villages received a half-day training. The trainings consisted of a classroom component where farmers learned about the technical requirements of building demi-lunes, like their size, spacing, and depth, and also certain land requirements like slope and soil type. They also received a booklet handed out to them that they could use as reference after the training. And part of that booklet is shown on the right that just shows the requirements for constructing demi-lunes. The second treatment arm consisted of training plus an early unconditional cash transfer of $20 US. This was meant to address liquidity constraints during the construction window. Farmers received this payment before demi-lune construction. Farmers in the training and conditional cash transfer treatment arm received training and 40 cents per demiloon paid after the number of demiloons constructed was verified. And then in the fourth treatment arm training plus late unconditional cash transfer, farmers received training and $20.50 after to distinguish between the unconditional cash transfer early and conditional cash transfer arms. And then the control group did not receive any training or cash. Next slide. So the data for the study comes from household level surveys conducted by the data collection firm Sahel Consulting before and after the program in 2018, 2019, and 2021. Observational data on demiloons constructed in June of each year, where enumerators counted the number of demiloons on farmers' fields and noted which demiloons followed the technical norms like size and spacing. And then in 2020, they visited all of the fields and took coordinates, which ensured a consistent sample of georeferenced field locations and observations regardless of adoption outcomes. And the study found that short-run adoption, which was measured 3 months after training, they found that 4% of households in control villages adopted demiloons, whereas farmers in treatment villages were 91% more likely to adopt. Additionally, there was no significant difference between the 4 treatment arms shown in the right. However, by the third year in 2020, all treatment arm adoption rates converged, meaning that the training had a persistent effect on adoption that cash transfers did not. And then regarding land usage and land quality and usage, the interventions increased agricultural production and improved land quality via these surveys that were conducted. Next slide. And so why were these adoption rates so high? It could have been because demiloons are privately profitable. They don't directly compete with other agricultural labor demands because they're conducted during the slack agricultural period. And there are a few other substitutes for recuperating degraded soils in Niger. And so this scale-up RCT seeks to bridge the gap between the smaller experiment scale and large policy scale by asking which features from this original study are most important and should be retained in the policy in order to see the same impacts as the prior RCT. So to investigate how the number of technologies introduced affects adoption, the study expands the trainings to include demiloons and Xi. So the first treatment group received training on demiloons only. The second group received training on only Xi. Third group received training on both, and the control group did not receive any training. And then to investigate whether larger trainings, which are cheaper to implement, deliver the same adoption impacts that first cross-cutting variation evaluates the impact of the size of the group invited. So the original RCT only invited 16 farmers from each village, yet they might be more cost effective if more farmers are invited. On the other hand, smaller trainings might be more effective for pedagogical or psychological reasons. So in half of the villages, I believe 16 farmers were invited, and then in the other half, all farmers were invited to the training. And then to assess the relative costs and benefits of using in-person versus remote sensing to monitor adoption, the scale-up RCT will involve in-person monitoring of half of the villages and remotely sensed monitoring of all of the villages. measure adoption. Next slide, please. So the goals for the Earth observation component of this RCT are to first measure adoption, rainwater harvesting adoption across all villages. So to detect demulins and xi, their presence. Second, to measure soil quality to complement the self-reported measures from the household surveys using different spectral indices like NDVI and soil moisture proxies. And then third, to measure agricultural outcomes, resilience, and other welfare outcomes to estimate whether adoption increases resilience to these weather shocks. And then the ultimate goal is to facilitate the Ministry of Environment's monitoring of demulins and to develop an identification protocol with accessible data. Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Lauren.
Next slide. Yes.
So to examine the economic benefits of demulins, we need to know their presence, spillovers, and to further their adoptions, we need to know areas suitable to develop demulins. There are multiple challenges that requires innovative ways to combine Earth observation data and products into demulin production adoption. First, the size of demulin is many times smaller than the spatial resolution of freely accessible satellite imagery, for example, Landsat and Sentinel imagery. Their spatial resolution ranges between 10 and 30 meters that makes them ineffective. Detecting adoption based on visual analysis of high-resolution imagery is cost prohibitive, and particularly it requires a personnel who is expert in visual interpretation techniques. Second, in this region, the time of year when some visual indications of adoptions are most obvious is also most susceptible to cloud cover. Finally, lack of land suitability data. The success of demulin depends on soil properties, seasonal moisture, and topographic properties such as slope and aspects. For example, slope creates microclimates that farmer can use to their advantage when growing plants. The downside of it is that it can be difficult to establish planting beds and is more prone to erosion than that of a flat surface. Water has a natural tendency to collect at the bottom of the slope while the top remains drier, but this can vary depending on the overall topography of the entire area. In general, a steeper slope and south-facing aspects tend to have more vegetation growth, while flatter slopes and north-facing aspects tend to have less vegetation growth. Overall, there are many other factors that can affect water harvesting in an area. Apart from these, farmers often select the most degraded land to construct demulins. To overcome these challenges, we are applying high-resolution satellite imagery using innovative geospatial method that will extend the time over which adoption is observed, expand the sample to cover new adoption that may occur. To accomplish this, we have established three main priority areas. We plan to detect and map demulins using high-resolution imageries, such as PlanetScope and SkySat over the study area. 2017 and 2018 period is a priority because we have the most survey data. 2017 is a pre-demulin period, and 2018 is to compare the result of first RCT. The figure you see, this is one of the high-resolution satellite imagery, and you can see how they are distributed. They are geographically and geographically in that area. To detect and map demulins, we focus on the properties of demulins. For example, the presence of demulins increases soil moisture and vegetation growth. That differs from surrounding areas that is often exposed soil. We will focus on seasonal variation of soil moisture and vegetation growth pattern using both semi-automated and automated methods. Semi-automated method will use moisture and vegetation growth through various indices such as normalized difference vegetation index, soil moisture index, and segmentation method. Automated method will rely on GLCM, that stands for gray level co-occurrence method, and machine learning techniques. GLCM matrices will serve as one of the key input to the machine learning method. The best model based on performance matrices will be used to estimate a spatial distribution of a spillover, an area that could have potential effect. The figure you see on the left side is basically shows a crop phenology for single crop and multiple crop, and along with deciduous forest and water bodies. The figure on the right is basically shows the pattern of soil moisture, precipitation, along with mean temperature throughout the year. To accomplish the second priority, we plan to develop land suitability using both rule-based land suitability and machine learning regression models to identify area with potential to have a spillover effect. The key parameter that we focus on include soil type, moisture, topographic characteristic, and long period soil moisture data. Topographic characteristics will include slope, aspect, and surface roughness. Demiluene presence and absence data will serve as a dependent variable, where the outcomes from this analysis will help to narrow down such areas for upcoming RCTs and to monitor their effects. Very high resolution imageries such as SkySat will be used to identify newly constructed Demiluene fields, including measuring agricultural output and soil quality in the geography. Finally, we plan to statistically analyze Demiluene's data with crop yield and various socioeconomic indicators to know their benefits and measure agricultural productivity. I also want to give you examples of data that we plan to utilize. We plan to utilize imageries from multiple sensors such as Landsat and Sentinel. Very high resolution imageries such as PlanetScope and SkySat will be analyzed using both visual and digital image interpretation methods using ground observation data. Outcome from these observations will play a crucial role in assessing the comparative performance of detection models. Entire analysis will be performed using various open source software to ensure its replicability, consistency, and comparability among outcomes across geography. And finally, the entire effort will yield land suitability models along with data, detection methodology, and socioeconomic impacts of Demiluenes. We plan to produce peer-reviewed articles, replicable methodological framework, scripts, method and policy briefs, and distribute them through various easily accessible platforms. And thank you.
Thanks so much, Lauren and Kunwar. Really interesting stuff. Again, folks, please go ahead and submit your questions to the chat.
Demiluenes, the distinction between Demiluenes and Xi. The images I showed were of Demiluenes. They're basically like larger planting pits than Xi. Xi is, they're both rainwater harvesting catchment techniques, but Xi's are much smaller, and that pretty much to the extent of my knowledge, that's their difference. I think plants might be planted in the Xi, like the small Xi pits, and then Demiluenes are really constructed on like one side of the field where water can run off, and because of that slope, and just catch in this field of Demiluenes. Approximate size of Demiluenes, 2 meters. Yeah, 2 meters across, 4 meters in between. Not sure about their depth.
Yeah, thanks so much, Lauren and Kunwar. We've got we're right at time, but that question's actually about Xi and other kind of pit planting techniques make me think similarly about external uses in other contexts where folks might be trying to harvest rainwater with smaller techniques like Zai or pit planting. And it'll be interesting to see as we complete this study, basically how small the rainwater harvesting technology can get before we lose the ability to find it and count it. So really interesting stuff. Yeah. Any other last questions for Lauren and Kunwar? Okay. Well, maybe just in the interest of time, we've got a slew of other talks as well. So thanks again, Lauren and Kunwar, for a really great talk. Okay, next we'll turn things over to Kyle Emmerich from Tufts and Carly Muir from, again, our A-Data Research Lab here in William & Mary to talk to us about water conservation and in irrigated rice in Bangladesh.
Great. Please let me know if the screen isn't coming through. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present this. My name is Kyle Emmerich. I'm a faculty member at Tufts in Boston, and then Carly from A-Data is going to present the more remote sensing part of this. This is two RCTs that we've done in Bangladesh, both on adoption and impact of a particular tool that farmers use to conserve water in rice irrigation. So I'm going to tell you about the two RCTs and then the ground measurements that we took during those. So the technology that we use in the two RCTs is called alternate wetting and drying. It's call it a technology, but you could also think of it as a tool, I would say. It's very simple. It's a plastic PVC pipe that you see in the upper left part of this image, with holes drilled in the side. Farmers insert that into the paddy field, the rice field, and they more or less use that plastic pipe to observe the water level below the ground and plan their irrigations accordingly. The idea is if you use what is called alternate wetting and drying, you're going to wait until the water level, which you can see in that plastic PVC pipe, falls to a 15 centimeter trigger below the surface, and then you're going to re-irrigate the field. Hence the practice being called alternate wetting and drying. So it's a very simple technology. In terms of the first RCT, which was, as I said, in Bangladesh, this was a cluster randomized control trial. It took place in 400 villages way back in 2017. These 400 villages are spread across 3 administrative divisions in Bangladesh, Rajshahi and Rangpur, which is on the sort of northern western side, and then Mymensingh, which is more in the central part of the country. Each village has 10 farmers in it, and these villages are split equally between a treatment and a control arm. And in half of those 400 villages, in the 200 treatment villages, we have provided, before that season, farmers with one of these AWD pipes, one of these plastic pipes, a short training on how to use this plastic pipe, plus our people help farmers install these in the fields. The control villages are nothing more than pure controls. And as I'll tell you about more in a moment, we used randomized visits to track irrigation practices. And then we have a follow-up survey at the end of the season where we look at crop productivity. The idea behind the technology is no effect on yield, but use less water. That's the main idea. So for that first RCT, here's how we constructed the ground measures. It's a picture that shows you the length of the season, say about 110 days. And those first 10 days are when these AWD installations happened. The remaining 100 days in the season, we chopped in half, and then we picked two random days for each village, and planned on sending our enumerators to those villages on those days, and they physically measured the amount of water that was in the field, and whether it was dry, as it is in the upper right there, or whether there was some standing water in the field. And we did this 2 times for each farmer. So that was 8,000 of these measurements spread all throughout the season. The only other thing I'll say here is during the flowering period, which is that red period there, farmers are instructed to stop using this practice, make sure the field has water, because when the rice crop is flowering, it really needs water. So I'm just going to show you the results from that first RCT, and then I'm going to jump to the second RCT and then pass it to Carly. So here are the results from the first RCT. First thing, which I haven't told you yet, is that our sample was split into areas where farmers were paying for water with what they call something like a volumetric price. That is, they paid for each unit of water that they pumped. That's the left panel of this graph. The right panel of this graph is the part of our sample where farmers were paying for water with a fixed price, a seasonal contract. They just paid per acre cultivated, not per unit of water extracted. And those blue lines are for the treatment group, those who had provided this pipe, and the black lines are for the control. So the main punchline is that when we measure water levels with the centimeters of water that were in the field, we do see that during the first, say, 70 days of the season with ground measures, there was a clear difference between the treatment and control in terms of the amount of water that was on those fields. But that difference only exists in the subset of our sample, which is about 1/3 of our sample, where farmers were paying for water volumetrically. Now that makes sense because they have to pay for the water that they use. They're actually incentivized to conserve it. So this technology works well for them. The other farmers don't face the right incentives necessarily to use the technology and to benefit from it. So that was the result there. We can look at the same exact thing with an outcome variable that is, instead of water level measured in centimeters, just a binary variable. Is the field dry? Does it have no water on it? And indeed, we see the same, which is for the first, say, 70 days of the season, when there's a volumetric price, those treatment fields were more likely to be dry and have no water. Right around the time of flowering, farmers tend to be, the gap between those two lines goes away. So the treatment effect goes away and it doesn't come back. So right around flowering, farmers reverted to their original practices in the volumetric places. So we've got those are the main results from the first RCT. Now I'm going to talk about the second RCT, where we took a different part of Bangladesh, Mymensingh, and actually, well, similar on the one side of our sample, but added Kishorganj, which is near to Mymensingh, both in northern Bangladesh. And we're operating in 360 villages. And in this RCT, we're going to study different ways of introducing subsidies for alternate wetting and drying. And so we offered AWD pipes to farmers at subsidized prices. And we did this in 360 villages. And those villages were divided into 4 groups. In 105 villages, we offered these subsidies directly to farmers in a door-to-door way. In another 105 villages, we offered these subsidies in meetings where farmers got together and made a joint decision. And then in another 105 villages, we offer these subsidies to the owner of the tube well. And our thinking there is that the owner of the tube well may actually be the one who has the incentives to conserve water, because in this part of the country, the owner of the tube well is charging farmers fixed seasonal prices for irrigation, and the owner of the tube well is paying the marginal cost of pumping. That is, the owner of the tube well is the one who pays the electricity cost of pumping. And so our thinking was that introducing the technology via that owner may have a larger impact. We also have a control group. So our ground measurements with this RCT were different. Our ground measurements here consist of measuring how much electricity the pump was using. So we sent people all over the countryside to read electricity meters for each of these pumps. And so we have a seasonal measure of electricity usage from the pump. Turns out this was a lot harder than I thought it was going to be, because meters break. People get confused about which meter they should be reading. And so the ground data were trickier here than I thought they were going to be. So here's the main result of that second RCT. And the outcome variable here is daily electricity usage in kilowatt hours from those pumps. And we're looking at this across the four groups in the experiment. And the main result is that we see reduction in electricity usage from the pump, but really only in that owner arm of the experiment. So only in that arm of the experiment where we went directly to the tube well owner, the water seller, and introduced AWD and subsidized AWD, do we see large treatment effects on electricity usage, and those were in the neighborhood of about 40%. That's what the graph on the right shows you. So the takeaway from that study is that targeted subsidies actually to water sellers, which seems counterintuitive at the moment, counterintuitive at first, targeted subsidies to water sellers reduce electricity use from groundwater pumping. So now I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Carly to go through the remote sensing angle of all of this.
Thanks, Kyle. Yeah, so how are we going to integrate geospatial techniques to enhance our understanding of the impacts from this project? Well, first I want to say that irrigation represents one of the most impactful human environment interactions and one of the most influential ways that we intervene with the terrestrial water cycle. So it's a really important thing to be able to measure and monitor. And this has remained a challenge, though. So, relying on the national level inventories of irrigation isn't the most reliable approach to this. So in the 1970s with remote sensing, there have been new techniques developed. These range in terms of the types of data that they're using. So we see some approaches with optical remote sensing, sensors like Landsat and MODIS, and these approaches are utilizing vegetation indices and thermal information to classify irrigated land. So where on the landscape do we see irrigation taking place? And then also to actually estimate the amount of water being used. Now, the problem with optical remote sensing is that the cloud cover can be an issue. And so to skirt that, folks have used the microwave-based applications. So things like SMAP, the soil moisture active passive, or synthetic aperture radar, or the SAR. And so this allows for measurement of water content in the soil despite the weather conditions. And an interesting example of this comes from Lovell in 2019, who used Sentinel radar and in-situ soil moisture data to develop a time series of a wetness index, specifically to look at the probability of adoption of AWD, or alternate wetting and drying, in Vietnam. So a lot of techniques being developed So certainly a lot of options for us in terms of how we want to map or monitor the AWD in Bangladesh. Next slide. All right. All right, I mentioned a couple of things on the last slide, our vegetation indices and soil moisture. But one indicator or variable that comes up a lot in using remote sensing to monitor agricultural water use is evapotranspiration. Evapotranspiration just being the movement of water from land surface to the atmosphere. You can see a diagram on the right there. And so this evaporation is coming from the soil, from water bodies, and then importantly from transpiration from the vegetation. And this is going to be a function of the vegetation on the Earth's surface, as well as the weather conditions, so things like humidity and wind. So ET as an indicator of AWD. What we expect to see is that the AWD should reduce the evapotranspiration because there's going to be less water available on the surface during the drier periods. So the drying and wetting periodicity is going to be captured as declining and increasing trends in ET. And so being able to look at a pixel level and see these time series of these trends in ET will allow us to identify what fields are adopting the alternate wetting and drying based on the trends that we see in this variable. Next slide. When it comes to modeling evapotranspiration, there are a number of many ways that this has been done. So I've broken it down into two. First is a land surface model. This is more of a predictive model, and it's based on a water budget, so really driven by precipitation. What we intend to use is a surface energy balance model. So this is driven by land surface temperature. You can see that on the right side of this diagram. And so it uses remotely sensed data to estimate energy fluxes at Earth's surface based on the energy balance equation, where we have the radiation and then our sensible heat, our latent heat, and the ground heat flux. So observing that information or obtaining that information through sensors and then allowing us to estimate evapotranspiration based on that energy balance equation. Next slide. With that in mind, we have some proposed methodologies. We intend to test different resolution sensors and algorithms. So data will be collected at the field level from a variety of sensors. We expect that it will be critical to have high frequency and high spatial resolution observations. The different sensors include MODIS, which is a 500 meter resolution, and that's what you see on the right here is data. The top graph is showing you vegetation transpiration from a treatment site in yellow and a control site in green. And so this is showing you transpiration in millimeters per day across several years. And what you'll notice is that there's really not much distinction between the control and the treatment, so indicating that higher spatial resolution is likely going to be necessary. The bottom graph is showing you the total soil evaporation from the different treatment sites and control sites across the growing season. And so this is a little bit more interesting than that top graph, because what we see is more distinction between the different groups in the year 2019, that first year that the AWD was implemented. But again, this is 500 meter resolution, so rather coarse. Now, to get at some finer spatial resolution data, we will use Landsat with a 30 meter resolution, and then also Sentinel-2 and 3, which is the resolution of which will vary. And then to get at our very high resolution data, we intend to use PlanetScope. So there's a nice example from Aragon in Saudi Arabia that uses PlanetScope to look at evaporation, again, at a very fine resolution. So with this data, right now there's two models that I'll be working on. The first is to, with the Sentinel data using the SenET Snap plugin. So, obviously looking at our Sentinel data there, this is a two-source energy balance model. And then with the other data sets using the Surface Energy Balance Systems model, SEBS from SU. So the inputs for this being albedo, emissivity, temperature, NDVI to get at the surface roughness parameter, various meteorological parameters, things like wind and humidity, and radiation. So this is, despite all of those inputs that I just listed, this is considered to be a more simpler surface energy balance model. It's a single layer. So analyzing just the vegetation and the soil evaporation together. However, there's possibilities to look at other models like the ALEXI, the atmosphere land exchange inverse model, which will analyze the evaporation from soil and vegetation separately. So lots of exciting things to look at here, and we'll see where this takes us. And I think that's all I've got.
Thanks so much, Carly and Kyle. Yeah, really an interesting context. Looks like some questions starting in the chat.
Okay, great. So it looks like Robert has, do you consider changes in methane associated with AWD? Is it feasible to use remote sensing of methane emissions from rice paddies to verify adoption, assess impacts of AWD on those emissions?
That's not something that I've considered or seen in the literature, but it seems like an interesting option, certainly something that I would have to think about further going forward, but it's a good question.
Yeah, I just haven't seen anything that is able to detect methane emissions at this level of like a 25 decimal or 0.25 acre field. If there is, then definitely that would be something for us to look into, because the agronomic trials of AWD suggest very large effects of using the practice on methane emissions, reducing methane emissions, that is.
Okay, so from Tulika, AG results project attempted to do that for verification of GHG reduction based on adoption of AWD. I'm realizing now that that was not a question, but a statement. Sorry about that. Just confirming the statement.
But that's useful. Thank you, Tulika.
Maybe, again, I can take the host prerogative while other people populate the chat, but to, again, think about the kind of applicability of models from elsewhere, like from Vietnam or from these other areas to the context of Bangladesh, and what particular challenges or opportunities both of you think there are that are specific to this context that might make it harder or easier to do.
I mean, I'll start with some of the interesting things about this context are small plot size, sort of fractured land holdings. That's, I think, probably very true in Vietnam as well. And irrigation decisions, which sometimes are communal. So an irrigation decision on plot A is potentially highly correlated with an irrigation decision on plot B, which is right next door, even though those farmers, those plots are owned by different people. And so those are, I think, both interesting parts of this. Another one is the prevalence of irrigation in Bangladesh. I think that especially in the sort of last 30 years, irrigation has really grown in size. And so being able to try and think through whether we can sort of extrapolate the measurement of AWD from this exercise to more broad parts of the country, I think is a hopefully exciting part of this agenda. So I think that would be a great outcome. So that's sort of within Bangladesh applicability.
I think in terms of applicability, my mind goes to other regions. I think we got maybe a bit lucky with this UK use case in that we're looking at the borrow rice season where cloud cover is not an issue. So, you know, as I said, there are options for microwave-based analysis that would get around the issues of weather, but in terms of applying this type of work in other regions in the tropics in particular, you know, we can use those microwave-based approaches, but they are going to be more complicated. So that's where my mind goes when we think about taking this type of analysis to other locations.
Excellent. Thanks to both of you so much. Okay, well, just in the interest of time, let's go ahead and move on to our third presentation. We'll have Kunwar again return, and this time in collaboration with Brad Segara from Mercy Corps. So Kunwar and Brad.
Thanks, Kunwar. I'll go ahead and jump in, and you can advance to the next slide. Thank you.
Yeah.
And thanks, Ariel and Richard, for bringing us together today for this exciting event. And I have to caveat that I am not an Earth observation expert, so please direct all of your hard questions to Kunwar. I am the Director for Resilience Research at Mercy Corps, and my portfolio focuses on various components of resilience and resilience measurement. And we're always interested in looking at ways in which we can measure our impact on building individuals, communities, and households' resilience. So today I have the privilege of presenting the MRED project, or the Managing Risk through Economic Development, that is being implemented in Indonesia, Nepal, and Timor-Leste with funding from the Margaret A. Cargill Foundation. It is it's a long-standing project that first began way back in 2012. And today we're going to be focusing exclusively on Nepal. And there's a brief map. This is the far west of Nepal, where we've been working with more than 50 communities, serving over 35,000 people. Next slide, please, Kunwar. So the activity we're going to be focusing on today is what we call the Nexus approach. And this is essentially integrating community-based disaster risk reduction and market systems development. So the kind of idea behind this is that can we kind of integrate production of agricultural commodities that have economic benefits and income earning potential, but simultaneously support climate adaptation and disaster preparedness. So this is particularly relevant in a context like Nepal, where flooding is already a major hazard in the country, and that risk is only expected to grow significantly in the context of climate change. So the idea is to sustain MRED, beyond Mercy Corps and the Margaret Cargill Foundation support after those activities end. These Nexus activities persist in the communities we serve. So what does this look like in practice? Next slide, please. In practice, this looks like planting sugarcane on in land that's vulnerable to flooding and river cutting. And so sugarcane has a number of kind of agronomic benefits in that it can withstand flood inundation for a relatively long period of time. It can slow down river speed, which mitigates against river cutting. And it also has the added benefit of regenerative property where clay deposition leads to increased productivity over the medium and longer term. And so we've been partnering with private sector partners in the region to plant sugarcane in these areas. And we're already seeing basically connecting households along these vulnerable riverbanks to local sugar mills for sales. Next slide, please. Since 2014, we've planted about over 3,300 hectares in this area, and you can see this is a cumulative area that we've planted over the years. And we've also observed, in addition to the sugarcane planting in MRED communities, we've observed neighboring communities starting to take this up organically on their own. And so we are realizing that there's some real potential for replicability and scalability. Next slide, please. So in terms of impact, I want to talk about what we already know and what we're hoping to learn. So we already know, based on a quasi-experimental impact evaluation post-flooding in 2017, that our MRED communities were more likely to have DRR plans in place. We're more likely to believe that they were able to withstand current and future shocks, and had higher access to important resilience capacities like access to savings, receipt of early warning information, things like this. We also have a fair amount of performance evaluation data that kind of demonstrated growth in key outputs and other intermediate outcomes that we would like to see in service of the bigger, larger impacts. And this is, like I said before, increased confidence and ability to respond and recover, reduction in negative coping strategies, and increased ability to resume income generation post-disaster. We're also observing, at least in self-reported household surveys, that households are reporting increases in sugarcane revenue. So in addition to supporting the plantation of sugarcane and other disaster preparedness activities in these communities, we're starting to see that households are indeed kind of using this as we had envisioned as an economic opportunity. And we also know that, sorry, apologies, this is not on the slide, but our activities have already attracted the attention of the government of Nepal. And this is evidenced through their investment increasing over 125% over the course of the second phase of MRED. And we're also seeing continued investment from our private sector partners. So this is, if you recall at the top, Ariel mentioning, the kinds of applications of Earth observation that GeoField is looking to do in this in this project. And I think this is, a good example of one of those look back activities. And so we're hoping to leverage Earth observation data to kind of look at complementary outcomes and specifically looking at how, can we measure reduced soil erosion and flood mitigation using that Earth observation data to complement all of the other kind of evidence we have of the impact and effectiveness of the MRED activity. I'll also say that this is in the MRED communities, it seems like this has been working. There's been some anecdotal evidence around spillover. There's a lot of government interest in scaling up this activity, and we also have some anecdotal evidence of this leading to increased agricultural productivity for other crops as the soil productivity is being renewed. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kunwar to talk more about the Earth observation component.
Thank you, Brad, for providing an overview of the EMRAD program. As Brad mentioned about the EMRAD program, evaluation has shown some promising gain among participating community, but the program's broader environmental impact have yet to be assessed. Questions that are yet to be answered are: what are the effect of EMRAD interventions on soil erosion, river cutting, and flood risk? What are the cost and unintended consequences of EMRAD interventions? What are the cross-village spillover in both geophysical and social diffusion terms? We will expand the use of remote sensing and geospatial modeling to create an annual panel and extend the evaluation work to reflect observed soil erosion, river cutting, and flood impact across Western Nepal. Our research will assess the magnitude of cross-village spillover as downtown communities benefit from reduced silt and turbidity, and nearby untreated communities see uptake of prompted crops. The EMRAD interventions aim to control soil erosion from flooding by prompting the plantation of sugarcane in the Thrai regions and fodder crop in the uplands areas. Sugarcane is a tall perennial grass with long growing season. It takes up to 230 to 360 days and grows more than 2 meters tall. Farmers in this region plant sugar in the spring between January and February, and in autumn between September and October. Existing quasi-experimental evaluation measured take-up of these crops via household surveys, but the known imprecision survey response limits the power of such analysis. To overcome this limitation, we plan to use satellite imageries from Landsat, Sentinel, and high-resolution imageries to detect sugarcane and fodder crops along the banks of rivers and streams in the proximity of both treated and comparison villages. While vegetation and crop types mapping using satellite imagery is a common practice, sugarcane detection and extent mapping with satellite imageries needs some effort, and so does the mapping of fodder crop. To accomplish this, we rely on crop phenology, which is the timing of life cycle event of crop from sowing to harvest. As a proof of concept, we use Sentinel imagery-derived normalized difference vegetation index to create sugarcane phenology to identify the peak growing season, which is often between September and October. We use this approach to map sugarcane for the one of the river valleys in Western Nepal using pure sugarcane plots from 2016 ground survey. These figures shows sugarcane phenology. The upper figure shows that the phenology of sugarcane of two different types of sugarcanes. And you can see there is a green up productivity, vegetation productivity, and then maturity. And at point when they are harvested, you will see steep decline, sudden decline. The bottom figure, the one you see, that is basically NDVI of a few plots. And you can see that means they are maturing between September and October period. This foundation will allow us to classify pixels with sugarcane stands. We plan to train and validate machine learning algorithms, then extend this approach to cover all sample areas in all years. We also plan to compare this data to the rollout program of EMRAD activities across the region. This will allow us to identify the extent and adoption of both treatment villages over time and in nearby comparison communities. To assess broader environmental impact, such as river cutting and soil erosion, we will rely on river sifting from year to year. As a proof of concept, we implemented our first measure, that is river cutting for one of the communities. We used very high resolution imageries available via Google Earth maps to trace the trace the river path in each year, and then compare the distance in path between 1 year and the next year. This allowed us to document incidents of river cutting. So the figure you see, they show that how river is shifting from year to year and how it is cutting the river banks and also exposes the soil that is basically patches of soil erosions. To map soil erosion, we will use two approaches. One is using satellite imageries. One is satellite imagery, and other is modeling. In satellite imagery case, the spectral reflectance of the exposed soil surface is highly peculiar and therefore distinguishable from other cover types. To estimate annual soil loss, we plan to utilize universal soil loss equation model. The universal soil loss equation is basically an average of annual soil loss, and it is based on empirical equation. In equation, means A is basically soil loss, R stands for erosivity factor, K stands for soil erodibility factor, L is the slope length, S is the slope steepness factor, C is about management factor, and P is about practices factor. We plan to extend these methodologies to cover all river patches in nearby communities. To accomplish these various tasks, we plan to utilize various satellite imageries along with digital elevation model to help us to not only map the crop types in Tarai areas and in the foothills of Nepal, but in hilly areas of Nepal, we also plan to utilize digital elevation model to understand the slope and aspect and various structure of the river system and stream system that can allow us to assess and measure soil erosion, river cutting, and also estimate flood risk. Through this analysis, again, we plan to produce several products that includes like estimating like a crop types map and sugarcane and photo crop types map, so soil erosion types and annual soil loss in that study area, and further implement those to understand causal identification. All the products will be either as a peer-reviewed publication type and then produce a replicable method that can be applied to different geographies in the same in Nepal or any other different parts of the world. This will also include a script that we will create using open access softwares. And we also plan to produce a method and policy briefs along with the hands-on exercises that can help others to replicate and utilize to their own impact evaluation work. And with this, thank you.
Thanks, Brad and Kunwar, for a really interesting presentation. I'm mindful just that we're over time for this session. So maybe I'll just hold any questions that you all might have. Feel free to pop them in the chat and we can see if we can squeeze them into either a later session or try to answer them directly with you all. But thanks again to all three of our use case presenters, some really exciting stuff. And we'll come back to how we plan to carry this work forward later on today. So maybe with that, let's just end our second panel. Again, thanks so much to all the presenters. And we'll turn now to our optional lunch activity. I'll let Nicole Hunt walk us through that for those of you who want to stick around. Again, feel free to go grab a bite and come back. But Nicole, I'll let you take over.